Good evening. Community. Before I get into my slides, I just have to address this. Less than 30 days ago, a very close friend of mine took his life. Community matters. And you know, one thing in my clinic, I have a staff member here in the front row. What I teach my staff is you have to love the people that come in the door. I don't care if the paperwork doesn't get done. I don't care if anything else is left behind. You must love people well. And as practitioners, if you don't hear a word that I say in the next 10 minutes, what I want you to go away with is people want to be seen and people want to be heard. And people can tell when you love them. And you know what? That is 90% of the healing. So it's important. Thank you, James, for bringing that to light. So when solving problems, digging at the root instead of just the leaves, this is what we live as functional medicine. Recently, I wrote an article about understanding HPA Axis Dysfunction. So tonight, in the few minutes that I have, I want to talk about this topic because it's very relevant to what we see every day in the clinic. It's just a comic that shows we have 3 exams next week, and the hypothalamic and pituitary are all communicating and getting lots of stress signals. Will you two shut up, says the adrenal cortex. I'm tired of getting the signal to produce more cortisol. So one thing I want to talk about tonight is setting the record straight. Even myself in my 15 years of functional medicine have used the term frequently, adrenal fatigue. And if you do, I'd recommend that you switch to using HPA axis dysfunction instead, because it's kind of a myth, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. Science really doesn't support the process that this chronic stress trigger always lowers cortisol. So what is HPA axis dysfunction? This is just a diagram to remind us of our biochemistry. And basically we have the hypothalamus at the top producing CRH to the anterior pituitary, signaling ACTH to the adrenals, which sit on top of the kidneys, producing cortisol. Now, cortisol has a role. It's got a really bad rap because there's so much stress, there's so much de-stressing and things to reduce stress, and we all have a lot of stress. That word is overused. However, some stress is good. It's called eustress. We can't function without a little bit of stress. But the problem is when that is chronically stimulated, we have dysfunction. And the old story of adrenal fatigue used to show that that stimulation on and on, so the stress button stuck on, would chronically trigger cortisol to be released. The poor little adrenal glands would get tired, and they would stop producing cortisol or decrease production. And in 2016, there was a landmark study that reviewed all the literature, and it was called Adrenal Fatigue Doesn't Exist. And the truth is we do have dysfunction, but you can have all types of different dysfunction, and it's not always lower cortisol over time. So to demonstrate this, I have a clinical case study, and we'll talk about this woman. She's a 47-year-old female who presents with gas, bloating, premenstrual symptoms, and migraines. She also has struggles with anxiety and irritability. She has a history of Hashimoto's, irritable bowel syndrome, bipolar. She has a tonsillectomy as a child and 2 children via C-section. Her mother had dementia and father had a heart attack at a very young age. She's married, 2 children, no known allergies, and currently on a gluten-free diet. As you can see from her height and weight, she's a little bit overweight. So key issues as we talk to her are fatigue, brain fog, Hashimoto's thyroiditis, irritable bowel syndrome, bipolar, with lots of irritability, PMDD. She does have high-risk celiac genetics on testing, and she has 2 SNPs that do affect her anxiety, that's CUMT, and she's single heterozygous for the MTHFR C677T. So let's look just a little bit at her testing, and then we'll give you a plan. This was a stool profile that showed an elevated eosinophilic protein X and an elevated fecal secretory IgA. Now I want to comment on that because stress in general will initially increase SIgA, and over time it will actually decrease. So stress's role is to activate the HPA axis, and when that's activated we produce cortisol, which downregulates downregulates immunity and also downregulates inflammation. That's a great thing for the short term, but in the long term, this can have a really big impact on immune a deficiency, and then this fecal IgA, which is our gut's mucosal immune system, can have an issue as well. Malabsorption and dysbiosis markers we can see that are slightly elevated, so there's probably some pancreatic insufficiency, there's some fungal and bacterial dysbiosis. And then from the vitamin markers, we can see that most of her methylated Bs are deficiently. In particular, she has elevated FIGLU, which is correlated with folic acid. And then hormones, and this is where we see some of the HPA axis dysfunction. So you see her total estrogen is decent, low normal. Her progesterone is right on the cusp of low. Testosterone, DHEA are lower. But look at that cortisol. So we don't know how long she's been under stress, but that's about as high as I've ever seen on a patient. It's almost, it's double of the normal range. So very, very high. They even put it in blue instead of red because it's so high. And then here we see both the free cortisone and the salivary free cortisol patterns also completely out of control. So what do we do with this? So her assessment was high cortisol and stress-induced, we call it HPA axis dysfunction. And again, with adrenal fatigue, we would expect if that was true, her adrenals would be depleted and there would be low cortisol. And that's not the case. And many of our patients experience this as well. She has low progesterone from the steal that happens. This will often, when there's an excessive pull on the production of cortisol, your body will make that at the expense of other hormones. Men will have lower testosterone and women will have lower progesterone, and they will tend to have symptoms as such. And this woman has PMS symptoms pretty severely. She also has intestinal dysbiosis, elevated eosinophilic protein X, which can be related to either food allergies or parasites or other inflammatory processes. It could be related to the SIBO and SIFO that we see on the testing. Her elevated SIgA also means that the gut mucosal immune system is irritated. And she has deficiencies in methylation factors. And that's critical because she's a heterozygous for MTHFR. So what do we do? So I gave her progesterone at bedtime. That helped her sleep and calmed her anxiety. Oral progesterone will go to GABA metabolites and is a wonderful calming agent for patients who need it. Phosphatidylserine at 200 milligrams at bedtime as well. Magnolia, one of my favorite calming herbs. High-dose probiotics for the gut, a methylated B complex, an antimicrobial herbal regimen for the SIBO and SIFO, and vitamin D, fish oil, and a gluten-free whole foods diet. And the most important thing, stress reduction tips. Now, before I go on to my last 2 minutes, Chris mentioned Dr. Jill's going to talk about mold. And guess what? I didn't, but I'm going to sneak it in because this woman, this case I put together from her initial couple visits, and recently we find out her home is full of mold. And there's no doubt in my mind the cortisol levels that you saw are related. There's a stress response that happens from the toxic exposure. So I did work in mold. Thank you, Dr. Shade. All right, so to leave you with stress reduction techniques, just simple things that you can take away. This is what I would teach the patients as well. Deep breathing. Prayer, meditation, deep breathing, really critical because you actually enhance your parasympathetic system and you slow down your sympathetic overdrive. Let's go forward. Okay, take sleep seriously. I have a reputation for actually turning down events that go past my bedtime because I really value sleep. And a lot of people are like, how do you do this, travel and do this and go there and that? Well, one thing I do is when I travel, I eat really clean. I don't cheat at all. And I sleep 8 hours every single night. So that really does make a difference on your HPA axis. Routine is huge. So just having a daily routine where you have the same wake-up time, the same exercise time, as much as possible if you can get into a routine. This is why jet lag has such a dramatic effect on the HPA axis. Those people who are world travelers, say they have an office in LA and an office in New York City, that's incredibly harmful to their HPA axis. Exercise, but in moderation. A lot of my type A patients, and even myself in my past, over-exercise, which does nothing for the HPA axis. So it's actually important to incorporate yoga or Pilates or deep breathing or walking or hiking or things that can decrease sympathetic tone and increase parasympathetic tone. And lastly, be fully present. And this guy, be fully present this moment on this side of the street, Monday through Friday, 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. So understanding the HPA axis dysfunction can help you get to the root cause of your patient's symptoms. And the fishes are saying, you've been awfully tense lately. They say petting a cat is a great way to relieve stress. And leave you with this. Sometimes that thing that's holding you back is all in your head.